In Unit 4, Module 2, I talked about release planning using OKRs. And I pointed to the problem with the story backlog or backlog grooming style of release management. But I do want to talk a bit more about why that exists and what can you do if you're stuck inside that paradigm. So this paradigm fundamentally comes from the idea of treating software delivery as projects. And what we do when we're working in a project format is we're thinking about end date, cost, and scope. And so this idea of taking these high-level epics and breaking them down into features and then into stories is fundamentally about working out how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take to deliver the thing. And so in this project-based planning paradigm, what typically happens is right at the beginning of the project, when we have very little information about what it is we're going to build, we'll hold some kind of discovery workshop where we'll think about the problem we're trying to solve and take that work and break it down into a bunch of stories. Often using the Connextra story format as a persona I want feature, so that benefit, but you don't have to do that. The point is that you're breaking them down into work that meets those invest principles we met in week 3. Those stories should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So small pieces of work. And what we'll do is we'll take everything we're going to build and break it down into features and into stories, and then we'll estimate each of those things. So we'll roughly guess how long it's going to take to do it. And there's all kinds of ways of estimating, and I don't want to go into that now because we'll revisit it in more detail later. But the point is we estimate it and then we add up all the estimates to work out how long it's going to take to do it. So what could possibly go wrong with this way of breaking up work into tiny little bits and then putting them all together? Well, there's many problems. Firstly, there could be dependencies between those bits of work. And typically, if you do work in that way, you will start mapping out dependencies. But there might also be dependencies between the work you're doing and the work of other teams or other systems that you rely on. So that can add complexity. There could be stuff you didn't think about. And that typically manifests as you do the stories, but it doesn't get the work done because there's stuff that we didn't think about when we broke the work down into stories. We just didn't consider it, or it wasn't obvious to us or visible to us that we would have to do that. There could be stuff we didn't know about. That happens all the time, where to build something, actually we discover we rely on some external system that is hard to manage, or some internal system that it's hard to make changes to. So that can happen. You might find there's some license for some software that you are relying on being able to use that doesn't work and you can't use it anymore. All kinds of things like that can happen. Then you could build the whole thing and find that it's not actually what people wanted. And that happens all the time. You think you know what'll work, and we might even agree on what will work, but then when you do user testing with it, you find out it doesn't achieve the objectives you wanted. And that's very painful as well. Or it might not even solve the problem. You might do user testing and find that it's not actually a good solution to that problem. So all those things can happen, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. All kinds of internal issues can prevent you from being able to deliver. Politics, non-functional requirements, architectural problems. You might have the wrong skill mix on your teams. All kinds of cognitive biases can come into play. And of these cognitive biases, perhaps the most problematic when we're working in the project paradigm is the planning fallacy. And this was written about by Tversky and Kahneman in their Nobel Prize winning work about behavioral economics. Executives tend to make decisions based on delusional optimism rather than on a rational weighing of gains, losses, and probabilities. They overestimate benefits and underestimate costs. They spin scenarios of success while overlooking the potential for mistakes and miscalculations. And as a result, they pursue initiatives that are unlikely to come in on budget or on time, or to deliver the expected returns, or even to be completed. The more critical and important the project, and the longer the project is, the more likely this is to happen. And it's really, really painful. And breaking down the work into little bits and then estimating them and adding all that stuff back up again is not really very effective at combating the planning fallacy. A much better way to deal with it is to go back to what are the objectives we're trying to deliver here? How can we take those long-term objectives and break them into medium-term objectives and then model those with OKRs and then deliver 1 month or 2 month or 3 month increments that provide value to some segment of our target audience, and leave it up to the teams to work out what to build in order to meet those medium-term objectives and then continue iterating. That is a much better paradigm for managing the planning fallacy, but it requires you having trust in your teams to be able to make those decisions and to be able to be autonomous. And many organizations just don't treat their people like that. The leadership believes that they know best and they want to be in charge of planning the project and working out what needs to be done, and then they're going to send these very detailed plans down to the worker bees to just implement it and do what they're told. And that's when we fall into the planning fallacy. That's when we build things that are not fit for use, not fit for purpose, that don't deliver the expected benefits. But it's very hard to break people out of this way of thinking. So you may find yourself in this situation, and there's a couple of things you can do. First, it's important to push back against it and point out that this activity of breaking stuff into little bits at the beginning, when we have the least information we will ever have about what it is that we're building, is a terrible way to manage the product risk. The point of this breakdown is to think about cost and time, but actually, a guy called Douglas Hubbard, who wrote an excellent book called How to Measure Anything, has done a ton of research into projects in IT, and he found this: even in projects with very uncertain development costs, we haven't found that these costs have a significant information value for the investment decision. The single most important unknown is whether the project will be cancelled. The next most important variable is utilization of the system, including how quickly the system rolls out and whether some people will use it at all. So the biggest project risks are: will it be cancelled and will anyone use it? Breaking everything down into little bits and estimating those little bits is a very poor way to manage those two risks. A much better way to manage those risks is to work in increments and iterate and make sure that every increment you're delivering real value to the organization, albeit a small segment of the total market that you wish to address, and that you iterate. That's a much better way to make sure you're delivering value from day one and that your project will not be cancelled, and to get feedback so you can validate whether you're building something that actually solves the real problem that you're trying to address. So that's a much better way than the kind of break stuff into little bits way of doing things. However, if you are forced into the breakdown little bits way of doing things, the one thing I will say about that is try and find a way to estimate the best case scenario and the worst case scenario in each of your estimates. In Waltzing with Bears, they do a whole bunch of project modeling, and they look at the probability of delivering at a particular time, and they find that the distribution of hitting your delivery date looks a bit like this. You're very unlikely to hit the ideal date. There's a wide distribution with a pretty long tail. And the way to think about this when you're estimating is to prime yourself. Let's think of the date if everything goes to plan. And then let's think of the date where it would be extremely embarrassing if we didn't hit that date. So that's one way to prime yourself so you can get a best case scenario estimate and a more realistic estimate for those pieces of work. The other way to manage this estimation process, if you're forced into it, is to try and do it at a very high level. Try not to break everything down into features and stories. Just think about very high level picture of what it is that you're doing and make high level estimates. The further out your estimates are, the more unreliable they are. And so the further out your estimates are, the more it makes sense to do them at a very high level. So if something is going to take you more than a few weeks, don't estimate in days, estimate in weeks or months. And if I go back to the HP LaserJet firmware case that we discussed earlier on, what we find is they would do this very high level lightweight planning exercise that could be done in hours, where they would look at all the different components or services that went into the system they were building, and they looked at all the different initiatives, not the features and stories within the initiatives, just the high level initiatives, and they estimated in firmware engineering months. So this is a very coarse-grained unit of estimation that is appropriate to long-range planning or medium-range planning. When you are planning more than a couple of weeks out, you're dealing with high levels of uncertainty, don't make detailed estimates. Certainly don't break everything down into little bits and make detailed estimates of those little bits and then add them up again. That just exacerbates the problem. So make very high level, coarse-grained estimates that are appropriate to a medium or long-range planning process. And again, what you see is for a 400-person program of work, these high-level estimates fit on a single page, which is the kind of granularity that's appropriate for that kind of level of planning.